to use sort of a memory to kind of keep our political space open is to kind of attempt to maintain some sort of consensus within a narrative that's increasingly becoming monolithic, that's increasingly becoming kind of just a single loud shriek of, terror, whether that's terrorism or be terrorized, be afraid. The more that we can maintain and cultivate, I think, what we actually experienced in the past 3 years, I think the more we can reclaim that from our kind of present perceptions of failure on the one hand, but also of attempts to scale it back. I think that, whatever bad things we might say happened in the past 3 years with the security vacuum or with the failures of kind of successive governments or whatever, I think that the moment of popular energy that we saw, even if it was sort of diffuse and was not necessarily organized enough to remain mobilized in a kind of traditional social movement fashion, that is something that remains with us. I mean, the only time that we saw, let's say, a large gathering of the revolutionary contingent out in the streets, besides this past 25th of January, which is itself a milestone, a marker of memory, was on Mohammed Mahmoud. That was the first time it happened. And ironically, I mean, that was the time when the state decided to build a monument to the martyrs, built by military contractors. This is effectively a monument built by the killers, and it was destroyed a day later by people who were going out on a commemoration of a particular event. But it wasn't simply, holding candles. It wasn't remembrance as much as it was that the event still had within it a charge. It still had within it an energy that, spoke to the present moment. The demands were different. The chants were different. That this became sort of a nexus around which, people could gather politically, but at the same time, I think it showed that there is the ability to take memory and develop it and to move beyond kind of what it originally meant, or to change what that meaning was. As we can see, in the way that Muhammad Mahmoud in particular has become a milestone for those who are opposed both to the Brotherhood and the military, and how that happened during Morsi, and how it meant something during Morsi, and how now it means something similar but perhaps a little different now. So I guess that is where I see things, and I think that these are the questions that I find important, and that I find important to me now. And I could talk for a little bit longer, but I would maybe just kind of like to hear from people out here, just questions, and maybe it'll encourage me to actually talk since I didn't seem to bring enough notes.
So there are two things I want to ask about. You kind of covered one of them, which is one is that monument, and when you're talking about memory and this sort of the brazenness of an attempt to rewrite against the people who actually and I guess I was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about what they're trying to do there, and what is that an overstep of manipulation of memory, or is that part of? I mean, what is that? What is the fact that they did that? Tell us about what their project is. And there's one other thing is how are you grappling with nationalism? Because that seems to be that's the field that they play on. And I remember when I was out, I lived downtown, and I was out during the summer, and you could see, so they have the holy leaders leading straight up, and you could see how they were building a certain individual into that narrative. And
Voldemort.
Yes, Voldemort. From Sauron to Voldemort to and how do you reckon with that? Because it seems like that a nationalist narrative, which is their home ground, seems to be one that's not easily escaped in discussion. So the strikes going on right now, I don't have enough access to the Arabic press. I try, but it seems like even the language saying, well, we want to oppose this person because he's bad for the nation.
I think as an interesting aside, I just have this memory in my mind of the July 2011 sit-in, when there was a kind of tent representing the Nasserist party, and it was just 6 old guys smoking cigarettes and newspaper every day, which is kind of really interesting to see the sort of revival of a nostalgia for the Nasserist period in recent months. But I think in the end they still are just 6 kind of old guys smoking cigarettes and reading the newspaper as much as one can drum up euphoria. And this is similar to the question of the monument. I think that part of what you have to think of is, are they actually trying to convince? Is anyone actually convinced, or is this just an expedient way to do something? I wonder about the level of conviction that some people have, I guess, for certain figures or certain characters. I think people are very instrumental in the way that they believe very often. Just because of various kind of things related to the sort of clientism of the state over the past 30 years, that it's very easy to just sort of jump on board with anybody who promises to kind of give you what you need. But as regards to the monument, I don't know that I think that they feel that they have to pro forma sort of speak in a certain language, which is also very interesting, that even the counter-revolution has now had to sort of adopt a sort of perverse language of revolution, that they have been affected, that they have been shaken. I think that they have to, have the trappings of populism now that they did not have to have before, which is ultimately, I think, going to be a strong kind of contradiction and a point of fracture and fractiousness as we go forward, when the people who are obviously just populist and being alone do fail to kind of advance any sort of populist agenda at the very least. I mean, we're talking still about businessmen and kind of crony capitalists and the like who are in power. But at the same time, they have to build the monument because they have to show their bona fides kind of in order to be able then to create an environment wherein they do not just seem like liars. I don't think anyone believes them. I really don't. I just have a sense that as much as people might even say this, that there's no strength to that. There's no strength of conviction. There's no kind of even ideology behind it. It tends to be just empty gestures. And I think that part of that is a psychological mechanism. Like, how does one stand by and watch the incredible amount of violence that's happened in the past 8 months without becoming severely traumatized? I think you have to create some sort of buttress around you. You have to kind of create justifications that, as paper thin as they are, allow you to basically say that this is for a cause. This is, to avoid kind of like a deep nihilism. You kind of end up creating these sort of Potemkin villages in your mind of just kind of, well, no, this is in service of revolution, or no, this is a war on terrorism. If I don't have this, it's the same way that people performed the curfew this past time. The Egyptian people have never cared about a curfew. Why did they care now? I think that if people had gone out in the streets the next day normally, there would have been no curfew for the several months that we saw it. I think that people felt that they had to be afraid, because if they were not afraid, that meant that there was no threat. And if there was no threat, then that meant that all of this violence was truly just sadistic, like that it was just nihilistic violence. And so I think that, in a way that this was an act of people, building kind of some sort of belief, some sort of narrative around them that allowed them to sort of deal with the just kind of the evolving horror around them from the state and the kind of counter-revolution. And as far as nationalism goes, I mean, it is a difficult struggle, but it's, I think, it's the same parties. It's the same kind of question of nostalgia. When you look at people's actual demands, they're not necessarily tied to nationalism or nationalist language. I mean, they might, it's an expedient language, but I don't think it's one that actually has, I mean, it gets to the point to where if everything, if everyone's doing everything for Egypt, then you kind of reach a zero-sum game when you're talking about kind of doing something for a local country or for Egypt. The Brotherhood is saying this, the army is saying this, the revolutionaries are saying this, everyone's holding Egyptian flags, and it really becomes sort of a trivial kind of quantity. It's one that I think has to be dealt with. I think that one has to kind of get around the sort of bind of nationalism, but I think that that's going to happen as you chisel away at the kind of edifices of the kind of clientist state, and as it chisels away as itself, as as the state moves to kind of more and more kind of towards austerity and towards kind of, like just sort of kind of severe measures like that, I think that, it as well is going to kind of turn people away from kind of ideas of nationalism as they understand it. So, I mean, I think both of your questions kind of, to me, strike at questions of rhetoric and how one attempts to justify and explain things. Not necessarily, I mean, I wonder how much action they're actually doing beyond kind of this sort of internal psychological sort of post factum justification. I don't know if that answers.
No, that's.
Hi, yes. I would like you to speak about the relationship between memory and technology, and what you think in terms of this technology enhanced memory, and that you mentioned how you have this arsenal, and so now not only do you have old memories, but maybe you even have new memories because you watch a video or see something like that. Or do you see it as a negative impact because the speed at which technology transmits images and transmit narratives might not create the time for reflexivity and to create more thoughtful responses, especially in terms of what you said about, like, we thought that was an emancipatory moment, but maybe now that is being retold in a different way because of, I mean, exactly what you just said about after the massacre, I thought that was really brilliant. And then I guess also in light of, my question also comes in light of, because I think coming from the West, there's this desire to kind of say, this was the Twitter revolution, or Facebook really kind of was quote unquote responsible. And I think that kind of undermines the power of the people, but also at the same time, I don't think we can deny that Twitter and Facebook created new spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you.
This would have been a more interesting talk. Maybe the latter question first. I mean, Twitter and Facebook perhaps do create new spaces. I mean, there's no kind of fundamentally sort of democratic nature to technology, as there's no point in being kind of an atavist. And, technology is tools. We've had technology since we've had fire and spoons, and all these things are technologies, and they depend on kind of the deployments within particular social environments and how we interact with them. I think that we saw this at its highest when Facebook, which is one of the more kind of trivial technologies created in the 20th century, was used and appropriated in order to kind of create a moment of organization. But it's very interesting, actually, to see then how that was contingent on a particular user base of Facebook, let's say, and I'm thinking even just specifically of the site page and the event, is that the kind of narrowness of the Facebook user base in Egypt, combined with the sort of novelty of this strike, allowed it to kind of be a lightning rod and to collect momentum that, as we've seen now, you cannot do anymore. Like, once you reach a certain point, there is a glut. I mean, Facebook and Twitter and all these create walled gardens. The spaces are there, but very often there are echo chambers. I mean, there are particular algorithms within Facebook that are giving me what I want to see, what I like, not necessarily a kind of, it is not a public space in that regards in many ways. These are closed spaces. I think, so that I think is an open question. I think that, technology can be used as a tool for organization, for mobilization, for spreading information, but it has no intrinsic kind of value. It is always instrumental. And I think now we're seeing where it is kind of become a zero-sum sort of game. As far as the question of memory and technology, it's very interesting. I think one really interesting thing is up until recently our archive was not organized. It was itself a very subjective kind of document of just layers of us adding footage in the middle of clashes or in the middle of something, and you could actually see when and how things arrived in the archive by what hard drive they were on, what folders they were in, how they were named. I mean, so actually finding anything in the archive for a long time has been almost, less a kind of card catalog than it's been sort of a walk through the woods. I mean, there's in that regard a very interesting kind of psychogeography to it, of kind of stumbling on things. A lot of the really impressive material that I found, and I was just by accident, by just kind of going through a file, following a folder, these kind of desire paths that you kind of go through. I think that being said, again, it's a question of how kind of technology is used instrumentally, is that even when one has a kind of indexed system, even when one has the ability to kind of put in a keyword and pull out a certain file, that does not correlate to a particular memory just so, that it's not a one-to-one issue. Again, looking for something, one often finds something else entirely. So, it's a really fascinating topic. And I think that it's one that I wish like I said, I wish I'd prepared more for and had, given myself the chance to kind of think about it more. But, I don't necessarily think that we lose from organization, or from kind of being able to kind of like really add this amount of data. But it is also interesting, when we did organize our archive finally, we ensured that we could keep the old file trees. So we have now an image of how it was in its total messy form, existing in parallel to the kind of heavily annotated, data-rich kind